Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we explore a question that has followed human beings across time and culture. What is a soul? Not as a fixed answer, but as something people have tried to understand, describe, and make sense of. Across ancient civilizations, early philosophy, and spiritual traditions, the idea of the soul appears again and again, sometimes as breath, sometimes as energy, sometimes as something that continues, even after the body is gone. Tonight, we'll move slowly through these ideas, not to define the soul, but to understand how it has been imagined, how it has been explained, and why the question itself has never disappeared. There is nothing to follow, nothing to solve, only a quiet unfolding of thought. Let your mind slow as we begin. In many of the earliest human traditions, the idea of the soul did not begin as something abstract or philosophical. It began as something directly observable, something that could be seen, felt, and lost. Breath. Across cultures that developed independently of one another, there is a striking pattern. Life was associated with breath, and death was understood as its absence. In ancient Greece, the word psyche, often translated as soul, originally meant breath or the movement of air. In Latin, the word anima carried a similar meaning, referring to breath, wind, or the force that animates a living body. In early Sanskrit texts, the concept of prana emerges, described not simply as breath, but as the vital force carried through breath, the underlying energy that sustains life. These parallels are not coincidental. They suggest that early humans, before formal philosophy, before structured religion, arrived at a shared observation that something invisible, something intangible, was responsible for the difference between a living body and one that no longer moved. Breathing could be seen. It could be heard. It could be felt. And when it stopped, something fundamental had changed. This led to a simple but powerful conclusion: that life itself depended on an unseen force, one that entered, remained, and eventually left. From this starting point, the idea of the soul began to take shape, not yet as identity, not yet as personality, but as the condition for life itself. In early Greek thought, when a person died, the psyche was believed to leave the body, often described as departing through the mouth or as a final breath released into the air. What remained behind was not considered fully the person anymore, because whatever had animated the body was no longer present. This idea appears again in early Egyptian belief, though developed in a more structured way. The Egyptians described multiple aspects of what we might call the soul, including the ka, a life force that continues after death, and the ba, often represented as a bird, capable of moving between worlds. Even here, movement remains central. The soul is not static. It travels, it separates, it returns. What becomes consistent across these early systems is not a fixed definition, but a pattern. The soul is something that moves, something that animates, something that cannot be held. As these ideas develop further, they begin to shift from observation to interpretation. The question is no longer only what leaves the body, but what is that thing? And more importantly, is it something that continues or something that simply stops? In early Greek epic literature, such as the works attributed to Homer, the soul after death is described as a shade, a diminished version of the self. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus travels to the underworld, he encounters these shades. They are present, but weakened, lacking the vitality of the living. They do not act freely. They do not possess full awareness. They exist, but in a reduced state. This is an important distinction. The soul is not yet understood as something fully independent or fully enduring. It continues, but not in a way that preserves identity completely. This changes as philosophical thought begins to develop. In the works of Plato, the soul becomes something far more defined. It is no longer simply the breath of life or a fading presence after death. It becomes the core of identity itself. Plato describes the soul as immortal, existing before the body and continuing after it. In his dialogues, he suggests that learning is not the acquisition of new information, but the recollection of knowledge already held by the soul. This idea introduces a profound shift. The soul is no longer tied only to life. It becomes the source of understanding, the part of a person that perceives truth. And in this view, the body is temporary, a kind of container, while the soul belongs to something more enduring. But this perspective is not universal. Aristotle, a student of Plato, develops a different approach. For Aristotle, the soul is not separate from the body. It is what makes a living thing alive. He describes different levels of soul. Plants possess a soul that allows growth and reproduction. Animals possess a soul that allows movement and perception. Humans possess a soul that allows reasoning. In this framework, the soul is not an independent entity. It is a function, a set of capacities. When the body ceases to function, the soul does not continue independently. This creates a clear contrast between two ways of understanding existence. One in which the soul is permanent, and one in which it is inseparable from the physical form. As these philosophical ideas develop in the West, a different but equally detailed set of ideas emerges in the East. In the early texts of the Upanishads, the concept of Atman appears. Atman is often translated as the soul, but this translation is incomplete because Atman is not simply the individual self. It is described as the deepest level of identity, beyond thoughts, beyond memory, beyond personality. It is not what changes, it is what remains. And in these teachings, Atman is not separate from the universe. It is identical to Brahman, the underlying reality that exists in all things. This idea removes the boundary between individual and world. The soul is not something contained within the body. It is something that the body participates in, rather than being a separate entity. It is part of a continuous whole. This leads to a different understanding of life and death, not as a beginning and end, but as a transition within a larger process. The concept of reincarnation follows naturally from this. If the soul is not destroyed and not limited to a single body, then it can move from one form to another. This movement is not random. It is influenced by karma, the accumulation of actions, intentions, and consequences. Each life becomes part of a larger continuity, not a single event, but one moment within an ongoing sequence. These ideas introduce a perspective that is neither purely material nor purely abstract. The soul is not only a force and not only an identity. It is a process, something that continues, changes, and moves. And as these perspectives continue to develop, the question itself remains not fully resolved, but deepened. What is the soul? If it is breath, energy, identity, or something that cannot be reduced to any one of these. And as the question settles, it does not demand an answer, only attention, only stillness as we continue slowly, as the idea of the soul develops across different traditions. It begins to take on structure, continuity, a sense of something that remains, even as the body changes or comes to an end. But not all traditions move in this direction. In early Buddhist thought, a very different perspective begins to emerge, one that does not attempt to define the soul more clearly, but instead questions whether it exists at all. This concept is known as anatta, often translated as no self. At first, this appears to contradict nearly every other system. If the soul is what continues, what gives identity, what moves from life to life, then what does it mean to say there is no self? To understand this idea, it helps to begin with observation. In Buddhist teaching, a person is not described as a single, fixed entity, but as a collection of processes. These are often referred to as the five aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Each of these is constantly changing. The body changes. Sensations arise and pass. Perceptions shift. Thoughts appear and disappear. And consciousness itself is not constant, but moment to moment. If each of these components is unstable, then what remains? That could be called a permanent self. From this perspective, the idea of a soul as a fixed identity becomes difficult to maintain, because nothing within experience remains unchanged. This does not mean that nothing exists, but that what exists is not unified in the way it is often assumed. Instead of a soul that persists, Buddhist thought describes continuity without identity, a process rather than a thing. A useful comparison is a flame. A flame can be passed from one candle to another. The second flame is clearly connected to the first, but it is not the same flame. There is continuity without a fixed essence. This idea carries into the concept of rebirth. In some interpretations, what continues is not a soul, but a pattern, a sequence of cause and effect, shaped by intention, action, and consequence. This is where the concept of karma takes on a different meaning, not as a system of reward and punishment, but as a natural process. Actions produce results, and those results influence future conditions, without requiring a permanent self to carry them forward. This creates a model of existence that is continuous, but not centered on identity. Life is not a single entity moving through time. It is a series of interconnected events, each influencing the next. This perspective changes the nature of the original question. Instead of asking, "What is the soul?" the question becomes, "What is it that we are calling a self?" And whether that label corresponds to something fixed or something constructed. In Buddhist practice, this is not only a philosophical idea, it is something to be observed directly through attention. When thoughts arise, they are seen as temporary. When emotions appear, they are recognized as passing states. Even the sense of identity, I, me, is observed as something that comes and goes, rather than something that remains constant. Over time, this observation leads to a shift, not in what exists, but in how it is understood. The attachment to a permanent self begins to soften, and with it, certain kinds of tension. The need to preserve identity, to maintain control, to define something that does not remain fixed. This does not remove experience. It clarifies it. Life continues. Perception continues. Awareness continues. But without the assumption that there is a single, unchanging center behind it all. This perspective stands in contrast to traditions that describe the soul as eternal, and also to those that describe it as entirely physical. Instead, it offers a third possibility, that what we experience as a self is real, but not permanent, not independent. and not singular. As these ideas settle, they do not eliminate the question of the soul. They reshape it from something to be defined into something to be observed. And as the distinction becomes clearer, the focus begins to shift again from whether the soul exists to how consciousness itself is experienced and what remains when identity becomes less fixed and more fluid. As the idea of a fixed soul becomes less certain, another question begins to take its place. If there is no permanent self, or if what we call the soul is not a stable entity, then what is it that continues? What is it that experiences, that observes, that seems to remain even as everything else changes? This question leads into the study of consciousness, not as a theory, but as something immediate, something that can be noticed across both philosophical traditions and contemplative practices. There is a distinction made between what is experienced and the awareness of that experience. Thoughts appear, images form, sensations arise, but alongside these, there is also the capacity to observe them, to notice a thought without becoming it, to feel a sensation without defining identity through it. This capacity is sometimes described as awareness itself, not as a thing, but as a condition in certain interpretations, what people refer to as the soul may not be an object, but this field of awareness within which experience takes place. This idea appears in multiple traditions. In some strands of Hindu philosophy, awareness is not produced by the body, it is fundamental. The body and mind are seen as expressions, appearing within awareness, rather than creating it. In these views, the distinction between individual and universal begins to soften. If awareness is not limited, then it is not owned. It is not confined to a single identity. This leads to the idea that what we call the self is not separate from the larger field of existence, but a localized experience within it. A similar observation appears in certain Buddhist traditions, though described differently. Awareness is recognized as present, but not personal. It does not belong to an individual. It is simply there, experiencing without a fixed center. This distinction is subtle but significant because it shifts the question again from What is the soul to what is it that knows experience? And whether that knowing requires a permanent identity behind it. In direct observation, awareness does not appear to have boundaries. It does not have a shape, a location, or a fixed duration. It is present, but difficult to define, and unlike thoughts or sensations, it does not come and go in the same way. Experiences change constantly, but the capacity to experience remains. This has led some traditions to describe awareness as continuous, not in the sense of memory or identity, but as a background condition within which all change occurs. From this perspective, what people have historically called the soul may not be a separate entity, but a way of referring to this continuity, a way of pointing to something that is present but not easily described. In Western philosophy, this question also appears, though approached differently. Philosophers have long asked, what is it that remains the same across time? If a person changes completely in body, in thought, in memory, what connects one moment to the next? Some have suggested that continuity is constructed, that identity is created through memory, narrative, and interpretation, rather than existing as a fixed core. Others have proposed that there must be some underlying subject, something that experiences all change, even if it cannot be directly observed. These questions remain unresolved, not because they are unclear, but because they refer to something that is not easily separated from the act of observing itself. To look for awareness is to use awareness, to define it, is to step outside it, which may not be possible. And so, rather than arriving at a final definition, many traditions return to observation, noticing what is present, without forcing it into a category. In quiet states, when attention is not fixed on any one object, there is often a sense of openness, of awareness without content, not empty, but not filled with specific thought. This has sometimes been described as the closest direct experience to what people have tried to describe as the soul, not as a thing, but as presence. And as this idea settles, the need to define becomes less immediate. The question remains, but it becomes softer, less urgent, and more open as attention continues slowly toward the nature of experience itself, as the question of the soul shifts away from a fixed identity and toward awareness, continuity, and experience. Another layer begins to emerge. Not just what the soul is, but how it is experienced, and whether it can be understood directly. In many Eastern traditions, particularly within Hindu and yogic philosophy, there is a distinction made between different layers of the self, not as separate objects, but as levels of experience. One of the most detailed frameworks describes the human being as composed of multiple sheaths. These are known as the koshas, each representing a different aspect of existence. The outermost layer is the physical body, the layer that can be seen, touched, measured. Beneath that is the energetic layer associated with breath, movement, vital force. This corresponds closely to the idea of prana, the life energy that flows through the body, not as something mystical, but as something directly tied to respiration, circulation, and motion. Deeper still is the mental layer, the field of thoughts, emotions, reactions. This is where identity often feels strongest, where the sense of I appears. But in this framework, even this layer is not considered the true self because it is constantly changing. Thoughts arise, shift, disappear. Emotions follow similar patterns. They intensify, fade, return in different forms. Further inward is the layer of insight, the capacity to observe, to understand, to recognize patterns. And beyond that is described something more subtle, a state of quiet awareness, not engaged in thought, not reacting, simply present. In these teachings, the soul, or Atman, is not located in any of the outer layers. It is not the body, not the breath, not the thoughts, not even the sense of identity. It is described as what remains. When all of those are observed, this idea introduces a different method of understanding, not through explanation, but through removal. If something can be observed, it is not the observer. If something changes, it is not the unchanging. And so, the search for the soul becomes a process of elimination, not finding something new, but recognizing what is already present. This approach is also reflected in meditative practices, where attention is gradually withdrawn from external objects to internal sensations, to thoughts, and eventually to awareness itself. In these states, there is often a shift in how experience is perceived, less centered on identity, more centered on presence. Not as a concept, but as something directly noticed. This leads to another important idea, that the sense of being a separate self may not be constant, but constructed moment by moment through attention, memory, and interpretation. This does not mean that the self is false, but that it is not fixed. It is dynamic, responsive, dependent on conditions. In contrast, some traditions describe the soul as entirely stable, unchanging, independent of circumstance. These two perspectives, one of constant change and one of underlying permanence, exist side by side, not as contradictions, but as different ways of describing experience. In some interpretations, they are not opposing views, but descriptions at different levels. At the level of experience, everything changes. At the level of awareness, there is continuity, whether that continuity is called soul or simply awareness remains a matter of interpretation. Another important concept appears in the idea of detachment, not as indifference, but as clarity. If the self is not fixed, then attachment to identity becomes less stable. And with that, certain forms of suffering begin to soften. The need to maintain a constant image, to protect a fixed sense of self, becomes less urgent. This does not remove experience, but changes the relationship to it. Thoughts still arise, emotions still occur, but they are not taken as permanent or defining. This perspective also influences how death is understood. If identity is not fixed, then its loss is not absolute. What changes is form, not necessarily the underlying process. This does not provide a single answer, but it reframes the question from What happens to me? 2. What is it that I am beyond change? And whether that can be identified or only experienced. As this line of thought continues, the focus begins to move further, away from defining the soul and toward understanding how meaning is created. Within these different perspectives and how humans have used these ideas to make sense of being alive, as the idea of the soul moves beyond a fixed identity and into something more continuous, more fluid. Another question begins to take shape. If something continues, if life does not end in a single moment, then what determines what comes next? In many Eastern traditions, this question is approached through the concept of karma. Karma is often simplified as a system of reward and punishment, but in its original context, it is not moral judgment. It is causation, action, and consequence. Every action, whether physical, mental, or intentional, creates an effect, not always immediately, but within a larger pattern. This pattern is not directed by an external authority. It is not assigned. It unfolds as part of the structure of reality itself. In this framework, the idea of the soul becomes linked, not to a fixed identity, but to continuity across change. What carries forward is not a personality, not a name, not a specific memory, but a pattern of influence, a shaping of conditions. This leads into the concept of rebirth, often described as the movement from one life into another. But this movement is not understood as a transfer of a complete self. Instead, it is more like a continuation of momentum, a process that unfolds. Based on prior conditions, a traditional comparison is that of a seed. A seed does not contain a fully formed tree, but it carries the potential, and when placed in the right conditions, it grows. The resulting tree is connected, but not identical. In the same way, rebirth is described not as repetition, but as continuation. The next form is shaped, but not duplicated. In Hindu philosophy, this process is connected to the concept of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, not as a single path, but as an ongoing sequence in which the soul, or Atman, moves through different states. This movement is influenced by karma, but also by understanding. As awareness deepens, the nature of this cycle becomes clearer, and with that clarity, a new possibility appears, the possibility of liberation, often referred to as moksha. Moksha is not a place and not a reward. It is a release from the cycle itself, a recognition that the underlying nature of the self is not separate and not bound by the conditions of birth and death. This idea introduces a shift in focus from continuing within the system to understanding the system, and through that understanding, moving beyond it. In Buddhist traditions, a similar concept appears, though described without reference to a permanent soul. Here, the cycle of existence is also recognized, but what continues is not a self, but a process driven by desire, attachment, and action. This cycle is referred to as samsara as well, and liberation is known as nirvana, not as an escape to another place, but as the cessation of the conditions that sustain the cycle. When attachment ends, when identification softens, when the causes of continued becoming are no longer present, the process itself comes to rest. This introduces a different kind of continuity, not something that moves forward, but something that ceases to repeat, a quieting rather than a continuation. These perspectives reshape the idea of the soul in significant ways. The soul is no longer simply what survives death. It becomes part of a larger system of cause and effect, of movement and stillness, of continuation and release. And importantly, this system does not depend on belief. It is described as something to be observed through attention, through reflection, through direct experience. Actions influence outcomes. Patterns repeat. Conditions give rise to new conditions. This can be seen even within a single lifetime. Habits form. Responses repeat. Thought patterns reinforce themselves, and gradually, these patterns shape experience. The larger cycle is understood as an extension of this same process, operating across a broader scale. This removes the need for a fixed soul, while still preserving continuity. Something continues, but not as a static identity, rather as a dynamic unfolding. And within this unfolding, there is both structure and openness, influence, but not absolute control. As this idea settles, the question shifts once more from what continues to how experience itself is shaped and how awareness interacts with the patterns that arise. As the idea of continuity begins to replace the idea of a fixed soul, and as patterns of action and consequence begin to explain what moves forward, another question begins to emerge. If there is no permanent identity, if what continues is not a stable self, then what gives rise to the sense that there is a self? What creates the experience of I, not as a philosophical concept, but as something immediate, something that feels present, constant, and real? This question becomes central, not only in Buddhist philosophy, but across multiple contemplative traditions. The experience of self is not denied, it is examined carefully, directly. In these traditions, the sense of identity is often described as something constructed, not artificially, but through a process, one that happens continuously, moment by moment. This process includes memory, the accumulation of past experience, which creates a sense of continuity, a story about who a person has been, and therefore who they are. It also includes anticipation, projection into the future, plans, expectations, which reinforce the idea that there is a single entity moving through time. Between memory and anticipation, the present moment becomes organized around a central reference point, I. But when examined closely, this reference point becomes difficult to locate. It does not appear as a stable object. It is not found in the body because the body changes continuously. It is not found in thought because thoughts arise and disappear. It is not found in emotion because emotions shift. It is not found in perception because perception depends on conditions. And so the sense of self remains, but without a clear location or fixed structure. This leads to the idea that the self is not a thing, but an activity, a process of identification where experience is continuously grouped and labeled as belonging to a single center. This process is not inherently problematic. It allows for coordination, decision making, interaction with the world. But when taken as absolute, it creates tension because it attempts to stabilize what is inherently unstable. In Buddhist teaching, this tension is described as arising from clinging, the attempt to hold on to identity as if it were fixed, as if it could be preserved, even as conditions change. This clinging is not always obvious. It appears in subtle ways. The need to maintain a certain image, the resistance to change, the discomfort when identity is challenged, and the effort to control experience so that it aligns with a stable sense of self. But when this process is observed closely, without interruption, a different pattern begins to appear. Experience continues, but the sense of ownership begins to soften. Thoughts still arise, but they are seen rather than assumed. Emotions still occur, but they are felt without defining identity. Actions still happen, but without the same attachment to a fixed outcome. This shift does not remove the self entirely, but changes its role from something that must be maintained to something that can be used, a functional identity, rather than a permanent one. This distinction is subtle but significant because it changes how experience is processed. Instead of reinforcing a fixed center, experience is allowed to unfold without needing to stabilize it. This idea also appears in Advaita Vedanta, where the distinction between self and awareness is explored further. In this tradition, the self that is constructed through thought, memory, and perception is considered not the true self, but a reflection, a temporary formation. The true self is described as awareness itself, not as an object, but as the condition in which all objects appear. This awareness is not personal. It does not belong to an individual. It is not shaped by identity. Instead, it is constant, unchanging. present in all experience. From this perspective, the sense of individuality is real but partial, a localized expression within a larger field. This leads to a different understanding of the soul, not as something separate, but as something that has never been separate, a recognition rather than a transformation. This recognition is not conceptual. It is described as experiential, something that can be noticed. When attention is no longer fixed on the changing elements of experience, but rests in awareness itself. In these states, the boundaries between self and environment can appear less defined, not because they disappear physically, but because the sense of separation is no longer emphasized. Experience continues, but without the same division between observer and observed. This does not require belief. It is described as something that can be noticed directly in moments of stillness, where attention is not pulled outward or shaped by constant interpretation. This perspective does not deny individuality, but places it within a larger context, where identity is functional, but not fundamental, and where awareness is not something created, but something that is always present. As these ideas deepen, the question of the soul becomes less about definition and more about perception, not what the soul is, but how experience is organized and what happens when that organization is no longer assumed to be fixed. This does not eliminate the sense of self, but it reveals its fluid nature, its dependence on conditions, its responsiveness to attention, and its inability to remain unchanged. From this perspective, the soul, if it is used at all, becomes a way of describing continuity without requiring permanence, a way of pointing to experience without fixing it into identity. And as this understanding continues, the focus begins to shift once more from identity to meaning, from what continues to why these ideas matter and how they shape the way life is experienced. As ideas about the soul move through different traditions, from breath to identity to awareness to process, another dimension begins to emerge. Not only what the soul is or whether it exists, but why the idea itself has appeared across cultures, across time, across entirely different systems of thought. The question begins to shift from structure to purpose. Why did human beings return to this idea again and again? What need does it meet? What function does it serve? Even when the definition changes, the presence of the idea remains. In early human life, the distinction between living and non-living was immediate, visible, something that could be witnessed directly, a body that moved, spoke, responded, and then a body that did not. This difference demanded explanation, not necessarily through formal reasoning, but through recognition. Something had changed, something that could not be seen directly, but whose absence was undeniable. This observation alone is enough to give rise to the earliest form of the soul, not as a belief, but as a response, a way of accounting for change. As societies developed and thought became more structured, this response began to expand. The soul became more than an explanation for life. It became a way of understanding identity, who a person is, what makes one individual different from another, even when outward conditions are similar. This leads to the idea of the soul as essence, something that defines a person beyond circumstance. But this raises another question. If the soul defines identity, then does it remain the same, even as a person changes? This question becomes central in philosophical traditions. If a person thinks differently, feels differently, acts differently, are they the same person? And if so, what connects these changes? Is it memory? Is it continuity of experience? Or is there something deeper? Something that does not change, that underlies all transformation? This search for continuity leads to the soul being used as a stabilizing concept, a way of maintaining identity within a world that is constantly shifting. But the role of the soul does not end there. It also becomes a way of addressing uncertainty, particularly around death. Death introduces a kind of finality, a clear boundary, but also a question: does anything continue? The soul becomes one possible answer. Not always, defined clearly, but present as a possibility, something that may persist, even when the body does not. In this way, the soul functions as a bridge between what is known and what cannot be directly observed. It connects experience to the unknown without requiring certainty. This bridging function appears across traditions in different forms. In some, the soul travels, moving from one place to another. In others, it transforms, becoming something less defined or returning to a larger whole. In still others, it dissolves entirely, with continuity existing, but not in the form of identity. These variations suggest that the soul is not a single idea, but a framework, a way of organizing experience, one that can adapt to different understandings and different needs in Eastern traditions. The purpose of the soul shifts further from explanation to transformation. The soul is not only something to understand, but something to realize. In Hindu philosophy, recognizing the true nature of Atman is not an intellectual conclusion. It is described as a direct experience, one that changes perception, and with it, the sense of separation between self and world. This realization is not presented as acquiring something new, but as removing misunderstanding, a process of seeing clearly what was always present. Similarly, in Buddhist thought, understanding the absence of a fixed self is not an abstract idea. It is something that alters experience, reducing attachment, and with it, certain forms of suffering. In both cases, the idea of the soul, whether affirmed or questioned, serves as a tool, a way of guiding attention toward a deeper understanding of experience, rather than remaining only at the surface level of identity, role, or external condition. This suggests another function, the soul as a direction, not a destination, a way of pointing rather than defining. When the soul is treated as a fixed concept, it becomes something to believe in, something to accept or reject. But when it is treated as a question, it becomes something to explore, something that invites attention without requiring resolution. This shift from answer to inquiry may be one of the most consistent patterns across the development of these ideas. The question remains, even as the answers change, and in some cases, the answers become less important than the process of asking, because the question itself directs attention toward aspects of experience that are often overlooked: presence, awareness, change, continuity, identity, and the space in which all of these appear. This leads to a final layer within this part: the soul as meaning, not in the sense of explanation, but in the sense of orientation, a way of understanding one's place within a larger context, whether that context is defined as a universe, a cycle, a field of awareness, or something beyond definition entirely. The idea of the soul provides a way to relate to that context, to consider not only what is happening, but what it means and how one exists within it. As these reflections continue, they do not arrive at a conclusion, but they deepen the sense that the question itself is part of the experience, not separate from it, and that the idea of the soul, whether understood as breath, energy, identity, awareness, or process, remains a way of engaging with the mystery of being alive without needing to resolve it. As attention continues slowly toward the meaning within experience itself, as ideas about the soul move from definition to experience, from structure to observation, they begin to take on a different kind of significance, not only as something to understand, but as something that quietly influences how life is lived, how experience is interpreted, and how attention is directed, whether the soul is described as a fixed identity, a continuous process, a field of awareness, or something beyond definition. Each interpretation carries with it a different way of relating to experience. In traditions where the soul is seen as permanent, there is often a sense of continuity, a feeling that identity extends beyond immediate conditions. That what is essential is not limited to the present moment. This can create stability, a sense of grounding, even as external circumstances change. actions, choices, and relationships are often understood in relation to something enduring, something that persists across time. In contrast, in traditions where the self is seen as impermanent, where identity is understood as a process, the emphasis shifts from preserving identity to understanding change. Experience is no longer something to hold on to, but something to observe, to move through, without needing to stabilize it. This can alter the relationship to thought. Instead of identifying with each thought, there is the possibility of noticing it as it appears and as it passes. Emotions follow the same pattern. They arise, they intensify, they dissolve without requiring a permanent center to contain them. This does not reduce the richness of experience. It changes the way it is held, less as something to define the self, more as something that unfolds within awareness. These different interpretations also influence how attention is used. If identity is fixed, attention may be directed toward maintaining consistency, protecting a sense of self, reinforcing continuity. If identity is fluid, attention may shift toward observing patterns, recognizing change, allowing experience to move more freely. Neither approach is inherently correct. Each reflects a different way of organizing experience, and each produces a different relationship to the present moment. Another important aspect appears in how these ideas influence perception. Perception is not neutral. It is shaped by expectation, by memory, by the structure through which experience is interpreted. If the self is assumed to be fixed, experience is often filtered through that assumption. Events are interpreted in relation to identity. What does this mean for me? How does this affect who I am? But if the self is seen as dynamic, the same events can be perceived differently, less as a threat to identity, more as part of an unfolding process. This shift is subtle, but it can change the tone of experience, from resistance to observation, from control to participation. In Eastern contemplative practices, this shift is cultivated intentionally through forms of attention that are steady but not forceful, observing the breath, not to change it, but to notice its rhythm, observing thought, not to stop it, but to see its movement. In these practices, the distinction between observer and experience becomes clearer, not as a separation, but as a relationship. Experience continues, but it is not automatically identified with. This allows for a different kind of awareness, one that is present but not entangled, engaged but not fixed. Over time, this way of relating to experience can become more stable, not as a rigid state, but as a tendency, a way of meeting what arises, without needing to define it immediately. This does not remove difficulty. It changes how it is experienced. Thoughts may still become repetitive. Emotions may still become intense, but the sense of being completely defined by them can begin to soften because they are recognized as part of a larger field of experience rather than as the center of identity. This shift also influences how time is perceived. When identity is strongly tied to past and future, attention is often pulled away from the present toward memory or anticipation. But when identity is less fixed, the present moment becomes more available, not as something to hold on to, but as something that does not need to be left. Experience unfolds here without needing to reference something else. This is not a permanent state, but a recurring possibility, one that becomes more noticeable as attention stabilizes and as identification becomes less immediate. In this way, the idea of the soul, whether understood as identity, awareness, or process, quietly shapes the structure of experience, not by imposing meaning, but by influencing how meaning is formed and how experience is interpreted. These influences are often subtle, operating beneath conscious awareness, but they can be observed in how attention moves, in how reactions form, in how identity is reinforced or released. And as this observation deepens, the question of the soul becomes less abstract, less distant, more connected to the direct experience of being present, not as a theory, but as something unfolding, moment by moment, within awareness itself. As this continues, slowly, the distinction between idea and experience becomes less defined, And what remains is the quiet movement of attention within the experience of being alive, as the question of the soul moves through different interpretations, from breath to identity to awareness to process. It eventually reaches one of the most enduring questions. Not what the soul is, but what happens when life comes to an end, not as an abstract idea, but as a direct event, a moment in which everything that appears continuous seems to stop or change or move into something that cannot be directly observed. Across traditions, this moment is approached in different ways, but often begins with the same observation that something is no longer present. The body remains, but the responsiveness, the movement, the awareness that once animated it is no longer accessible. This absence becomes the foundation for the question of continuation. If something has changed, has something also left? And if so, what is the nature of that departure? In early traditions, this was often described in physical terms as breath leaving the body, or as a subtle form departing at the moment of death. In later traditions, the description becomes less literal and more experiential, focusing not on what leaves, but on what remains or what ceases. In certain Hindu traditions, death is not understood as an ending, but as a transition, a movement within a larger continuity. The body ceases to function, but the underlying process, the continuity shaped by karma, does not stop. Instead, it gives rise to new conditions, new forms, new expressions of experience. This continuity is not described as a single entity moving intact, but as a sequence, a chain of causation, where each moment influences the next, even across the boundary of death. This idea is extended further in certain interpretations, where the moment of death itself is described as a process, not instantaneous, but unfolding in stages as the body's functions slow, as sensory input fades, as the connection to external experience diminishes. Attention is said to move inward toward subtler layers of experience. This is not described as something visible, but as something that can be inferred from the gradual withdrawal of responsiveness. And in some traditions, this inward movement is considered significant, not because it determines a final outcome, but because it reflects the state of the mind. At the point of transition, in Buddhist traditions, the process of death is also described in terms of dissolution, not of a soul leaving the body, but of the components that make up experience, gradually separating. The body loses strength, sensation diminishes, perception becomes less stable, mental activity changes, and eventually the conditions that support conscious experience are no longer present. From this perspective, there is no single entity that departs, but rather a process that ceases and gives rise to new processes through the continuity of causation. This continuity is not visible. It cannot be traced directly, but it is described as consistent with the patterns observed during life. Actions influence outcomes. Conditions give rise to new conditions. And this structure does not end at death. It continues without requiring a permanent self. In contrast, certain philosophical perspectives in the West approach the question differently, focusing not on what continues, but on the nature of consciousness itself. What is it that experiences, and what happens to that experience when the body can no longer sustain it? Some have proposed that consciousness is entirely dependent on the brain, that it arises from physical processes and therefore ends when those processes stop. Others have suggested that consciousness may not be fully reducible to physical activity, that it may represent a more fundamental aspect of existence itself. These perspectives do not arrive at a single conclusion, but they reflect the same underlying question: whether experience requires a stable subject or whether it can arise as part of a larger process. In contemplative traditions, the focus returns again, not to theory, but to observation. What can be noticed directly within experience itself, in moments of stillness. There is awareness, even when thought is quiet, even when identity is not being actively reinforced. This awareness does not appear to depend on any specific content. It is present, regardless of what is being experienced. This leads to a subtle but important question. If awareness is not tied to specific thoughts or sensations, or identity, then what happens to it when those elements are no longer present? Is it something that ends or something that is no longer expressed? This question does not have a definitive answer. And in many traditions, it is not treated as something to be resolved, but as something to be understood through direct experience, rather than speculation. In this way, the idea of the soul becomes less about defining what continues and more about understanding the nature of experience itself. What is present, what changes, what remains, and how these are related. As attention rests on these questions, without forcing an answer, the need for a fixed conclusion begins to soften. The question remains, but it becomes quieter, less urgent, less demanding, and more open, allowing for different possibilities without needing to choose between them. As this openness deepens, the focus shifts once more from what happens after death to how life is experienced while it is present, and how these ideas shape the way each moment is understood. As awareness continues, slowly, through the experience of being, without needing to define what cannot be fully contained. From breath to identity, to awareness, to process, from continuity to change, to presence, the question of the soul remains, not fully answered, but no longer demanding an answer. Across cultures, across traditions, across centuries of thought, the idea has shifted, expanded, taken different forms, and yet it has never fully disappeared. Perhaps not because it can be resolved, but because it continues to point toward something that is always present, the experience of being alive, the sense of awareness, the quiet recognition that something is happening here, now, in this moment, not as a concept, but as something directly known, without needing to define it, without needing to hold on to it. Just the simple fact that experience is unfolding. Thoughts arise and pass. Sensations appear and change. Perceptions form and dissolve. And through all of this, there is a continuity, not necessarily of identity, not necessarily of memory, but of presence, of awareness, of the capacity to experience, whether this is called a soul or something else entirely, has varied across time. Some have described it as eternal, unchanging, independent of the body. Others have described it as a process, dynamic, shaped by conditions, without a fixed center. Still others have suggested that the question itself may not be fully answerable, because it refers to something that cannot be separated from the act of experiencing it. And so, rather than arriving at a conclusion, many traditions have turned toward observation, toward noticing what is present, without forcing it into a fixed form. In quiet moments, when attention is not pulled in many directions, there can be a sense of stillness, not the absence of experience, but the absence of urgency, a space in which thoughts move more slowly, in which sensations are softer, in which the need to define begins to fade. In these moments, the question of the soul does not disappear, but it becomes gentler, less something to solve, and more something to rest with, to allow without needing to reach an answer. And in that allowing, there is a kind of ease, not because everything is understood, but because understanding is no longer required, just the quiet recognition of experience unfolding without resistance, without needing to be fixed or held or explained. From this place, the distinctions that once felt important between self and other, between beginning and end, between what continues and what does not, begin to soften, not disappearing, but becoming less rigid, less absolute, more open. And within that openness, there is space for experience to move without needing to be defined, without needing to be contained. Just as breath moves in and out, without effort, without needing to be controlled, the same rhythm appears in attention, in awareness, in the quiet unfolding of thought. And as this rhythm continues, the sense of searching can begin to slow, not because the question has ended, but because it no longer needs to be pursued. It can simply remain in the background, like a distant thought or a quiet echo, present but not demanding. And as the mind settles even further, the space between thoughts becomes more noticeable, not empty, but open, not silent, but calm, a kind of quiet that does not need to be filled. In this quiet, there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to define, nothing to resolve, only the steady movement of awareness itself, gently, without effort, without direction. And as you remain here, there is no need to think about the soul, no need to decide what it is, or whether it exists, or what happens beyond this moment. Those questions can rest, just as attention rests, just as the body begins to settle into stillness, into ease. Let the ideas fade. Let the distinctions soften. Let the need to understand drift gently away. There is nothing to follow now, nothing to remember, nothing to figure out. Only the quiet presence of this moment and the gentle rhythm of breath moving slowly in and out as everything becomes softer, quieter, more distant, like thoughts fading into the background, like sound becoming quieter, like the mind settling into rest. You don't need to hold on to anything from this. You don't need to take anything with you. Everything can simply fade slowly into stillness, into quiet, into rest. And as the last thoughts drift and the mind begins to settle, there is nothing left to do, nowhere to go. Only this quiet, this softness, this gentle unfolding. As sleep begins to take shape, slowly, naturally, without effort,